Inventory of the goods, chattels, books, monies and personal effects of the late Reverend Hollis Wainwright of the Curate's Cottage at Wensley by the How in the North Riding of Yorkshire, taken Friday the 18th of September, 1818, by Robert Treadgold, solicitor, of Northallerton. Item 1. The cottage, being the property of the Wensleydale living, reverts to the patron upon the death of the present incumbent and is not included in the present inventory. Item 2. One annuity in the 3% consols, settled upon the late Mrs. Isabel Wainwright in 1798, with reversion at her death to her 2 daughters in equal share. The elder daughter, Mrs. Joanna Whitley, having predeceased the Reverend on the 4th of December 1815 without issue, the entire annuity reverts to the surviving daughter, Miss Clemency Wainwright, £30 per annum. Item 3. Books. 3 boxes, comprising 127 volumes of sermons, classical texts and parish records. Bequeathed entire to Miss Clemency Wainwright. Item 4. Household furniture. 1 writing desk of mahogany, 1 small bookcase, 6 oak chairs, 1 oak table, 1 feather bed, 1 washstand with ewer and basin, 1 tea set of plain Staffordshire ware, 12 pieces, 3 chipped, 1 set of plain Sheffield plate, knives, forks, spoons, 18 pieces total. Bequeathed entire to Miss Clemency Wainwright. Item 5. Personal effects. 1 gold wedding band, 1 mourning locket containing a curl of the late Mrs. Wainwright's hair, 1 walking stick of plain oak, 1 silver pocket watch in working order. Bequeathed entire to Miss Clemency Wainwright. Item 6. Outstanding debts at the time of decease. Nil. Item 7. Outstanding charges upon the estate. The funeral expenses of the present incumbent, estimated at £8 8s. To be discharged by the next quarter's rent of the Curate's Cottage to its incoming occupant under the standing arrangement of the Wensleydale living. The widow's daughter, Miss Clemency Wainwright, to vacate the Curate's Cottage by the last day of October, 1818, to make way for the incoming curate, by which date she shall be at liberty to remove her bequeathed effects to such other lodging as she may obtain. So taken, this Friday the 18th of September, 1818, Robert Treadgold, solicitor. Miss Clemency Wainwright, small, neat, dark russet hair pinned plain, hazel eyes that did not flinch, in plain black bombazine, her father's mourning, sat at the small mahogany writing desk in the south parlour of the Curate's Cottage in the cold, pale blue late afternoon of Friday the 18th of September, 1818, and read the inventory through twice in the steady country lamplight. She set it down upon the desk with a hand that did not tremble. She was 26, the only surviving daughter of the late Reverend Hollis Wainwright, curate at Wensley by the How, these 31 years. Her mother, Isabel, had been laid in the churchyard in the autumn of 1812, when Clemency was 20. Her elder sister, Joanna, married to Mr. Whitley of London in the summer of 1814, had died in childbed at How Park in the December of 1815, without issue. Since her mother's burying, Clemency had kept her father's house, the marketing, the linen, the small accounts, the parish poor box, the Sunday school for the village girls, quietly and without remark. The funeral was held on the Tuesday following, the 22nd of September, at St. Andrew's, Wensley by the How. The parish came in soft numbers and stood in the back pews in their plain market clothes. The Reverend Carlyon, white-haired country clergyman, gold-rimmed spectacles, plain black cassock, was the rector of the living, and had known Hollis Wainwright as his curate these 20 years, and as his friend these 18. He read the plain country grave service from the prayer book in the steady voice he used for every parish burying, and he did not, in the body of the service, depart from the form. He spoke at the lesson a sentence of his own, that the Reverend Hollis Wainwright had been a quiet, faithful man, a careful reader, a kind friend to the village poor, and a father who had brought up his daughter to a steady, plain piety. And he returned to the form. Clemency sat at the front pew alone in her plain black bombazine. Mr. Whitley had sent a black-edged letter of regret from London. He could not, his hand wrote, leave his counting-house at the present quarter. Mr. Treadgold had come from Northallerton in his plain black superfine and sat across the aisle. The two Calvert pews under the gallery, the Duke's pew and the Dowager's pew, were both empty, as they had been each Sunday these 5 years since the late Duchess of Wensleydale had been laid in the family vault. At the burying in the small east corner of the churchyard, beside the plain headstones already standing for Mrs. Isabel Wainwright of 1812 and Mrs. Joanna Whitley of 1815, the Reverend Carlyon spoke the committal in his steady voice and signed the cross above the coffin with his right hand. The parish women laid small bunches of late Michaelmas daisies upon the turned earth. The men kept their hats in their hands. The sexton, Mr. Outhwaite, who had dug the grave on the Monday afternoon, stood quietly at the foot of the plot in his market coat with his cap in his hand, and waited until the family, which is to say, the daughter, had drawn back, before he and his boy began the careful shovelling. When the parish had gone away in their slow, soft pairs along the lane, Clemency walked the quarter-mile back to the cottage alone. Mrs. Bell at the post-house and Mrs. Ridley at the smithy had each offered to walk with her or to sit with her at the cottage parlour the rest of the afternoon. She had thanked them and declined. She wished, she said quietly to Mrs. Bell at the lych gate, to go in by herself. Mrs. Bell pressed her hand and let her go. The lane lay quiet in the soft, midday autumn light. A robin sat upon the upper bar of the gate at the bottom of the glebe field and watched her pass with the small, bright, incurious eye of a country bird that had seen many burials. Clemency lifted the latch of the cottage gate, stepped through, and drew it to with the small, careful click of the iron tongue. She went in, shut the front door, and went through to the kitchen to put the kettle on the hob in the steady habit of 23 country years. The fortnight that followed was the practical fortnight. 3 boxes of books were taken down from her father's small bookcase in the parlour, sorted by his pencilled hand in the inside cover of each volume: the sermons, 43, the classical texts, 61, mostly Cicero and Horace, with a small Greek New Testament that had been his Cambridge prize at Caius in 1778, and the parish record copies, 23, and packed in the 3 plain pine boxes the carpenter Mr. Skelton had made for 2 shillings the pair last Saturday. Her own small wardrobe trunk took her plain country gowns, her 3 black bombazine gowns of the present morning, her plain linen, her 2 pair of plain country shoes, the green woolen shawl her mother had knitted in the winter of 1810, and the small black-edged handkerchief Joanna had hemmed for her last birthday. The mahogany writing desk, which had been her grandfather's at the rectory at Bedale before her father's father had died in 1796, she had paid the carrier 8 shillings to take ahead by wagon to the booking office at Northallerton, to be sent on to her London address when she had one. The household linen, the worn sheets, the kitchen towels, the table linen Mrs. Wainwright had marked in cross-stitch as a bride in 1795, she sorted into 3 piles for the village poor on the rector's plain practical recommendation, and Mrs. Bell and Mrs. Ridley came on the Saturday afternoon and carried them away in 3 baskets to the cottages, where the rector said they would be most wanted before the winter came in. Room by room, the cottage emptied. The south parlour first, where her father had sat at the small mahogany writing desk on Sunday mornings these 20 years preparing his sermons in his slow, careful hand. The lamp turned low, the small fire kept up by Clemency from the kitchen end of the cottage. She could see him there yet, when she came into the parlour with the empty box upon her hip. The bent grey head, the steady right hand moving across the half-sheet. The small pause when he laid the pen down to think a moment, the way he had said over his shoulder without turning, Clem, is the kettle on? And gone back to his page when she answered that it was. Then the kitchen, where her mother in the spring of 1810 had sat by the window mending Clemency's school pinafore in the bright, pale light of an April morning, her plain wedding band catching, the small kettle on the hob. Her mother had taught her the steady country household, the marketing, the linen press, the keeping of the small accounts in the Green Book, through the 4 years between Clemency's 12th and 16th birthdays, in that same kitchen at that same window, and had said to her once that a woman who could keep a quiet house could keep a quiet mind, and that the one was the trellis upon which the other grew. Then the small back bedroom that had been Joanna's till her wedding day, in the August of 1814, Joanna in her plain white muslin at the church door, laughing at Mr. Whitley over her shoulder, the small bunch of late roses in her hand, and that had been kept as Joanna's still through the 8 months of her London marriage, and that had been empty since the dreadful black-edged letter of the 7th of December 1815, in which Mr. Whitley's narrow, careful hand had written that his dear wife had been brought to bed on the 3rd with a daughter who had not lived the hour, and that on the 4th at 4:30 in the afternoon, Mrs. Whitley had herself been taken. Clemency had been 21 then. She had read the letter standing at the front door of the cottage, in her plain country gown, and had gone in to her father at the writing-desk in the parlour and laid it before him, and had sat upon the small oak stool at his elbow. And they had been very quiet together for a long hour. Then her father's room, the small front bedroom looking south to the lane, where the Reverend Hollis Wainwright had lain through the 4 days of the quick fever, taken on the Sunday evening visiting in the parish, and where on the Friday morning at 6:20 he had drawn his last quiet breath, with Clemency's hand in his, and the lamp turned low at the bedside. He had not been afraid. He had said only twice, "My dear," and once very softly, "Be steady." These had been his last 3 words. Clemency had not been able in the moment to say anything in return, but she had pressed his hand, and he had known. The 3 years between Joanna's death and his own had been the quietest of her life. He had grown a little slower in the legs, a little softer in the voice, and a little more careful with his books. He had not grown frightened. He had said to her one evening in the spring of 1817, sitting by the parlour fire, that she had been a good daughter, and that he had taken the comfort of her steady company as a man takes the comfort of a small steady fire on a long evening, and that he hoped she should one day have such a fire of her own to sit by. He had not pressed the point. He had been a careful man. On the Tuesday morning, the 29th of September, at 10:30 by the small bracket clock in the south parlour, Mr. Treadgold came on the appointed call. He took the plain oak chair Clemency offered him at the writing-desk, set his leather case across his knees, opened it, and took out 2 papers. His professional gravity was brief and quiet and country careful. "Miss Wainwright, the new curate, a Mr. Thorne, is to come down from Cambridge on Monday the 5th of October. Mr. Thorne is a young man, unmarried, of plain habit. The Reverend Carlyon has had the offer in the post on Friday last, and accepted it on the Saturday. The standing arrangement of the Wensleydale living requires that the cottage be vacant by the Saturday previous, which is to say, Saturday, the 3rd of October. I am very sorry to put a date upon it. I have no discretion to extend. I had supposed it would be so," said Clemency. "Saturday the 3rd is convenient. I shall go by the 11 o'clock London mail from the Northallerton Inn. You have a lodging fixed in town?" "My uncle's old governess, Mrs. Pelham, lives in a small house at Bayswater. She has had the offer of her back room from me by the post last Thursday. I shall have her reply, I expect, by Friday morning." "Quite proper. Then upon the other matter. The annuity, Miss Wainwright, £30 a year. Paid in 4 equal quarters by the trustees of the Consols. The next quarter falls due upon the 25th of December. Under the standing arrangement of the Wensleydale living, I am authorised, when the curate's family is leaving the parish, to forward the next quarter's payment by the Northallerton Bank to any London address you may name. The bank is Backhouse and Company at Northallerton, with a correspondent at Smith Payne and Smith's in the city. Shall I make the arrangement to your Bayswater address? You shall, Mr. Treadgold. Thank you. Mrs. Pelham's full name and the Bayswater direction, if you please. She wrote them on a half-sheet at the desk in her small, steady hand. He folded the half-sheet into his case. Then the arrangement is made. Backhouse and Company will have your direction by the post tomorrow. You will receive the Christmas quarter at Bayswater on or about the 28th of December. I shall write you a covering letter. Thank you, said Clemency. You have been very kind. It is the standing arrangement, said Mr. Treadgold gravely. It is what your father would have wished. He took her hand at the cottage door, made his small, careful bow, and went down the gravel sweep to his hired gig. That evening at her father's writing desk, with the lamp turned low and the small fire steady at the parlour end, Clemency drew a sheet of plain writing paper, dipped her father's pen, and wrote to Mrs. Pelham at Bayswater. The letter ran to 14 lines. Dear Mrs. Pelham, you will have heard by this time, by the kindness of the Reverend Carline's letter of last Saturday, that my dear father was taken from us on the morning of Friday the 18th. I am at last orphaned. The cottage is the property of the living and reverts to the new curate, who is to come down from Cambridge on the 5th of October. I am required to be out by Saturday the 3rd. I have my £30 a year of the old annuity, and my father's books, and the small writing desk that was my grandfather's. Might I, as you so kindly offered me at my uncle's burying in May of last year, come up to you by the London mail on the Saturday, and take the small back room at the agreed 30 shillings a quarter? I shall give you no trouble. I keep myself quiet, and I have my own occupations. I remain, in great affection and gratitude, your faithful Clemency Wainwright. She sealed it with a plain black wafer, directed it in her careful hand, and laid it on the small hall table for the post-boy in the morning. The reply came by return on the Friday morning, the 2nd of October, on a single half-sheet of plain pale blue paper in Mrs. Pelham's careful old hand. My dearest child, of course you shall come. The small back room is aired and ready these 3 days. I had been expecting your letter from the moment I had the rector's of last Saturday. Come up by the Saturday mail. I shall have a hot dinner upon the table at 1:30 in the evening, whatever hour the mail sets you down at the Bayswater turnpike. I am 63 this October, child, and I am not so steady upon the stairs as I was, but I am very well in the parlour and the kitchen. You shall not find me a trouble. I shall not lock the front door until you come. Your old governess, who loved your dear mother and loves you, Eliza Pelham. Clemency read it twice at the breakfast table, folded it small, and put it in the inside pocket of her plain black bombazine, against her heart. Saturday, the 3rd of October, 1818. 8:15 in the morning. The cold blue Yorkshire. October light lay flat upon the small gravel sweep at the cottage gate. Clemency stood at the cottage door in her plain black bombazine, with her green woolen shawl drawn close, her small black bonnet tied plain under the chin, her father's silver pocket watch in the inside pocket of her gown against her hip. The 3 pine boxes of books stood ranged upon the gravel sweep beside the small wardrobe trunk. The mahogany writing desk, wrapped in sacking and tied with the carpenter's twine, had gone ahead by the Thursday's wagon to the Northallerton booking office. Her father's effects, the gold wedding band, the mourning locket, the plain oak walking stick, the silver pocket watch already in her pocket, were folded in their small black valise at her feet. The carrier was to come from the village at 8:30 for the boxes and the trunk. She was to walk the half-mile down the lane to the inn at Northallerton for the 11 o'clock London mail. The cottage door stood open behind her, the small front hall empty. The bracket clock on the parlour mantelpiece taken down and packed. 8:30 passed. The carrier did not come. Clemency did not look at her father's watch. She stood at the boxes and waited in the steady country composure she had been brought up to. 9:15 passed. She walked once to the cottage door, looked once into the empty front hall, came back to the gravel sweep, and stood again at the boxes. 9 o'clock. She drew the front door closed at her back, turned the heavy iron key in the lock, and laid the key upon the small flat stone beside the gate, where by the agreement with Mr. Treadgold, the rector would come at noon to take it up. The cottage was now empty and locked. 9:15. She did not pace. She did not look at her father's watch in her pocket. She stood at her boxes on the small gravel sweep at the front gate in the cold blue October morning, and she waited. At 9:30, at last, the small slow rattle of cartwheels turned up the lane from the village. Mr. Skelton's old grey carrier pony at the bridle, the plain country cart behind, Mr. Skelton in his plain market coat, raising his hand from the seat in apology. A wheel rim, Clemency would in a moment hear, had loosened at the bridge and had taken him 3/4 of an hour to wedge, but behind Mr. Skelton's small cart, also turning at the same moment up the lane from the village, came a second carriage, a black and burgundy travelling coach with 4 bay horses harnessed in pairs, a coachman in dark country livery on the box, a footman behind, and on the panel of the door, picked out plain in old gold, a small device, a culver head over a sheaf of barley, the arms of the Dukes of Wensleydale. The travelling coach drew up at the front gate of the curate's cottage behind Mr. Skelton's cart. The horses stood, blowing soft, white breath into the cold blue morning. The coachman set the brake. The footman came down from behind, set the carriage step at the door, and stood back. Clemency turned at the boxes to face the coach. The carriage door opened. A man in a dark country travel coat stepped down. He set his boot upon the gravel of her father's small front sweep, straightened to his full height, and looked at her. She had, for the breath of 1 second, the strong, unsettled feeling that she knew the face. That she had, somewhere in the proper soft years before her sister's death, stood quite near it in the steady country lamplight of some country room and looked up at it once. She could not, in the cold blue October morning of her father's 3rd Saturday in the churchyard, place it. The man inclined deeply. He did not at once put on his hat. He spoke in a deep, quiet voice, in steady country gravity. "Miss Wainwright, I beg your pardon for arriving at the same hour as your carrier. May I assist?" The Wensleydale travelling coach turned up the cottage lane at 9:30 of the cold blue October morning, and Clemency, standing at the gate with her 3 corded boxes of books and her wardrobe trunk and her small mahogany writing desk set in a row upon the gravel sweep, drew a single steady breath and watched it come. It was a plain, dark coach with the Wensleydale arms in dull paint upon the panel, and a single coachman upon the box, and 2 grey horses, and it pulled up before the cottage gate with a quietness of harness and wheel that did not, in the still country air, disturb the rooks in the elms. A gentleman descended first, tall, dark-haired, with 1 streak of silver at the right temple and a quiet jaw, black at his cuff, still for a wife, dead 5 years. He wore plain dark superfine and a single black mourning ring, and he carried his hat in his left hand, and he stood for a moment upon the gravel, and looked about him at the cottage gate, and at the 3 corded boxes, and at the small composed figure in plain black bombazine, waiting for the London mail. Then he inclined to her. It was a small grave inclination, neither hurried nor distant, of a gentleman to a lady at a country gate, and Clemency, in steady composure, inclined to him in return. "Forgive me, madame," he said. The voice was low and steady and educated, and carried with the small Yorkshire vowel of a man who had not gone south often. I had thought to find Mr. Wainwright's cottage empty by the week's end, not the morning. Will you permit me? May I be of any help with the boxes? Your Grace is kind, Clemency said. I am waiting for the carrier and the London mail at 11. The carrier is presently inside, fetching the last of the linen. I had not understood you were leaving Wensley today. He looked at her with a steady, quiet attention. Mr. Treadgold, who has come down in the coach with me, has not had the chance to mention it. He half turned to the coach, and the second occupant descended at his look. Mr. Treadgold in his plain black superfine, with his gold-rimmed spectacles and his leather case of papers, who had stood at the writing desk a fortnight before to read the inventory through, who had taken her father's signatures and her own. He inclined to Clemency with a brief professional gravity. Miss Wainwright. Mr. Treadgold, good morning. Good morning, ma'am. His Grace and I are come down to view the cottage before the new curate's arrival on Monday. I had supposed your removal not till the afternoon. The carrier was bespoke for 9. He is an hour late. The London mail is at 11 from Northallerton. She said it quietly and steadily, and with no particular emphasis, and Mr. Treadgold inclined. The carrier came round at that moment from the back of the cottage with the last bundle of linen wrapped in a sheet, and set it upon the gravel beside the boxes, and said, low and rough, That be the last on it, miss. I'll fetch the cart up. And he went off down the lane to where his cart and his old grey pony stood beside the lych gate of the church. Clemency stood at the gate in the cold blue light, and Severin stood 3 paces from her on the gravel, and Mr. Treadgold a pace behind him with his leather case, and the rooks moved in the elms, and in that near minute of country quiet she placed his face. She had it, all at once, with the steadiness with which she had read the inventory through twice. The Howe County Assembly of the August of 16, 2 summers before, when she had been at Howe Park with Joanna. The long room above the inn, the country fiddlers, the muslin gowns of the Howe girls, the dark-haired gentleman who had stood up with her for the 2nd set and again for the 5th, who had spoken to her gravely and kindly of Cowper and of the Yorkshire harvest, who had not, in the press of the country dance, learned her name, whom she had supposed at the time to be a Calvert cousin visiting from Wensleydale, and whom she had not, since that night, expected to see again in her life. She had not, at the time, known his title. She had not known then that his elder brother, the 3rd Duke, had been dead 2.5 years, the title come to him in March 14, of the same fever that had carried Lady Marjorie 6 months before. She had supposed him a younger Calvert son at his country pleasures, and she had thought him kind. She had carried, in the steady way of a young woman who did not encourage herself in such things, no particular memory of the night beyond the gravity of his voice and the small grave manner in which he had returned her to Joanna at the close of the 5th set. Joanna had teased her once in the carriage going home, and had not teased her again. By the December, the question had not survived its own quiet asking, for the December had brought Joanna's coffin and the child's small coffin together to the Howe vault, and Clemency had not gone to a county assembly since. She kept her face composed. She kept her hands quiet at her bombazine cuff. She waited. Severin looked at her steadily for a moment longer. Then he spoke. Miss Wainwright, forgive me. I have, in the past minute, placed where I had known your face before. Will you do me the honour of confirming it? The Howe County Assembly of August 16. Your Grace, the same. You had been a visitor at Howe Park with your elder sister, Mrs. Whitley. Whitley. Yes, she died, I am very sorry to learn, the following December. In childbed, Your Grace, of her first child. The child was not saved. I am very sorry. Thank you, Your Grace. She said it quietly and steadily, and looked at him plainly, and did not lower her eyes. He was silent a moment. Mr. Treadgold stood a pace behind him on the gravel, his leather case at his side, and made no movement and offered no remark. He had the lawyer's understanding of when not to speak. "Miss Wainwright," Severin said, "the Northallerton mail is not till 11. The carrier is here now. May I ask you, will you do me the honour of a private quarter hour at the cottage parlour, while Mrs. Furnival, my housekeeper at the park, is sent for from the avenue as a proper chaperone? I have something I should wish to put to you before you take the carrier's cart down to the turnpike." Clemency was silent for a small, composed moment on the gravel. The rooks were in the elms. The cold blue light lay upon the cottage gate and upon the 3 corded boxes and upon her father's writing desk set in its place at the end of the row. "Your Grace," she said. "I accept. I thank you." He turned to the coachman upon the box. "Joseph, be so good as to drive up to the park at once and bring Mrs. Furnival down. She is to walk back with you on foot if she prefers. The coach to come back at 10:15. Tell her it is to chaperone Miss Wainwright at the curate's cottage at a private quarter hour, with myself and Mr. Treadgold." "Aye, Your Grace." The coachman touched his hat and turned the horses and went up the lane. The carrier had come back with his cart, and Severin spoke to him. The lady would not be needing the cart till the afternoon at the earliest. Would he wait at the lich gate or step inside the kitchen at his ease, and his fare would be paid in full whether or no. The carrier touched his hat and said he would step in at the Black Bull for a half pint and come back at noon, and was that agreeable? And Severin said it was, and the boxes were lifted, the 3 corded boxes and the wardrobe trunk and the writing desk, and set down again upon the gravel close against the cottage wall, out of the morning wind. Clemency walked back through the open cottage door and into the front passage, and Severin followed her at a proper 3 paces, and Mr. Treadgold followed with his case. The south parlour of the curate's cottage was empty of all furniture save the small mahogany writing desk standing in the middle of the bare boards and the 2 oak chairs Clemency had kept until the last hour for visitors. The bookcase was gone. The fender was gone. The case clock from the corner had gone the previous afternoon, with the linen press in the Wensleydale carter's wagon, up to the Northallerton repository, where her father's furniture should sit at storage at 6pence a week until she had a London room to call it to. The fire was out. The grate had been swept that morning at 7 by Clemency's own hand. The cold blue October morning came through the leaded south window upon the bare boards. Mr. Treadgold inclined and said, "I shall, with your Grace's leave, wait at the front door with my ledger." And he went out into the passage and stood at the front door upon the step in the cold blue light, his case open upon his arm, with the discretion of a country solicitor of 30 years' practice who had stood at many such doors. Severin handed Clemency to one of the oak chairs, and she sat with her hands quiet in her lap, and he sat in the other, a proper 3 feet across the bare boards, and laid his hat upon the floor beside his chair, and looked at her steadily across the cold parlour. "Miss Wainwright, I shall ask you a few plain questions, if you will permit me. I do so not from any wish to intrude upon your private affairs, but in order that I may speak plainly to what I have to put to you, and that we may both of us know upon what ground we stand." "Your Grace." "Ask them." "Have you family at Wensley?" "None, Your Grace. My mother died in 12, my sister in 15, my father a fortnight since. My mother's people are in Worcestershire, and have not written in 11 years. My brother-in-law, Mr. Whitley, lives now in London with his second wife. We exchange a Christmas letter. You have been alone in the cottage for the fortnight." "I have, Your Grace." "Have you been called upon by the parish ladies, Mrs. Carter at the Manor, Mrs. Lambton at How Hill, Lady Pickering at the Lodge, to offer you a winter's lodging?" "I have not, Your Grace." He was silent. She continued quietly. "They had each, in the first week after my father's funeral, written kind notes of condolence. Mrs. Carter sent down a basket. Mrs. Lambton sent her carriage with Mrs. Lambton's compliments to convey me to morning service at St. Andrew's the Sunday after. Lady Pickering wrote in her own hand. None of the 3 notes contained an offer of shelter, Your Grace. I had not expected that they should. You are therefore proposing this morning to go up to a Bayswater lodging on £30 a year with a former governess of your late uncle's. Mrs. Pelham, Your Grace, the same. I have her letter of yesterday morning. She will receive me with kindness. She will not lock the front door this evening. He inclined. I mean no slight upon Mrs. Pelham, he said. I have not the honour of her acquaintance, and I have no doubt she is what you say. I mean only to set out plainly, Miss Wainwright, that the choice before you this morning is not the choice that a daughter of a Wensleydale curate, 26 years of age, with 3 boxes of books and a £30 annuity, ought to be obliged to make at 9:30 of a cold October Saturday, in the absence of any other offer from the parish. He paused. I propose, strictly upon a formal written arrangement to be drawn up this afternoon by Mr. Treadgold, the following. The rectory's small dower cottage in the rectory garden, vacant since the death of the last rector's mother in the autumn of 15, 2 clean rooms and a parlour and a kitchen, with the use of the rectory's well and of the parish coal, at a peppercorn rent of 1 shilling a year for 6 months, payable by yourself in advance from your annuity, under the standing benevolence clause of the Wensleydale estate, which has housed 2 Crimean half-pay officers and a clergyman's widow over the past decade upon the same terms. The cottage is yours to use as you would your own. The 6 months is yours to make a more deliberate decision than the next London coach can permit. He stopped. Clemency heard him out without movement. The cold blue light lay upon the bare boards. The case clock corner was empty. There was no ticking in the parlour. Mr. Treadgold's small dry cough sounded once from the front doorstep. The rooks moved in the elms beyond the window. She was silent a long, composed moment. Your Grace, I had not expected your kindness this morning, nor any morning. May I ask plainly what your motive is in this proposal? He answered at once, in steady gravity, looking at her across the bare boards. Miss Wainwright, my motive is that I remembered your face from a Howe County Assembly 2 summers before, and that the steadiness of your father's curacy at Wensley over the past 11 years has been quietly known and approved by his patron, and that I am unwilling, in my office as that patron, that the curate's daughter should be put upon a London mail at 11 o'clock on a cold October Saturday, in circumstances of straitened £30 a year necessity, which I am in a small position to alleviate without impropriety. The decision is wholly yours. If you should prefer the London mail, my coach shall take you to Northallerton at once, and your fare to the carrier shall be paid by myself. He paused. I do not press, Miss Wainwright. I wait. She did not answer at once. She sat in the oak chair in the cold parlour and looked across at him and was silent. And he did not press, and the cold blue October light moved a small fraction upon the bare boards. There was a step in the passage, Mr. Treadgold's voice, low and grave. Mrs. Furnivall, ma'am, of Wensleydale Park. The housekeeper came in, iron-grey hair beneath plain linen cap, plain bombazine. She had walked the half-mile down the avenue from the park at the coachman's word. She had come without bonnet, in her clean linen apron, and she stood in the parlour doorway and inclined to Clemency with a steady country warmth that asked no questions. Miss Wainwright, I am sorry for your loss, ma'am. I knew your father well. He visited my late husband in his last illness in the spring of 15. His Grace bid me come down. Mrs. Furnivall, you are very kind. The case clock corner was still empty, but Mr. Treadgold, with the quiet of his 30 years' practice, drew his small silver pocket-watch from his fob and observed in his low, dry voice that it was 10:15 by the church. Clemency inclined to him. Then she looked across the bare boards at Severin and at Mrs. Furnivall in the doorway, and she spoke, in a quiet, steady voice that was meant to reach them both. "Your Grace, Mrs. Furnivall, I accept the offer of the Dower Cottage upon the proper terms for 6 months. Mr. Treadgold, would you be so good as to draw up the formal written arrangement this afternoon? The peppercorn rent of 1 shilling for the 6 months I shall pay in advance from my annuity, in coin this morning before I leave this parlour." She paused. "I shall not, however, accept any further arrangement beyond the Dower Cottage itself. I shall not have a household servant sent down from the park. I shall not be supplied from the park's kitchen. I shall not have the use of the park's carriage. My 3 boxes and my wardrobe trunk and my writing desk shall go up to the Dower Cottage in the Wensleydale wagon, if that may be permitted. I shall walk the half-mile myself." She did not soften the terms. She did not, in the cold parlour, look anywhere but at him. Severin inclined to her, deeply from the chair. He did not rise. "Miss Wainwright, I accept your terms entire. The Dower Cottage is yours upon them." "I thank you, Your Grace." Mr. Treadgold opened his case upon his arm at the front door and made the entry in his ledger, in his plain, dry country hand, beneath the date of the 3rd of October, 18. Half an hour later, at 5 minutes after 11 of the cold blue October morning, Clemency walked the half-mile from the curate's cottage gate at Wensley by the How to the Rectory Dower Cottage in the Rectory garden, with Mrs. Furnivall at her elbow in plain bombazine and clean linen apron. She walked steadily. She did not look back at the curate's cottage door. The Wensleydale wagon had gone ahead, in the charge of Mrs. Furnivall's own son, who was the under-coachman at the park, with her 3 corded boxes of books, and her wardrobe trunk and her small mahogany writing desk. The Wensleydale travelling coach had been sent on with Severin and Mr. Treadgold up the avenue to the park, where the morning's business of viewing the curate's cottage in preparation for Mr. Thorne would, by mutual arrangement, be conducted at a later hour. The carrier had returned at noon from the Black Bull, been paid his fare in full from Severin's purse, and been sent home with the Duke's compliments. The Rectory Dower Cottage stood at the end of the Rectory garden, plain stone and plain slate, with a low stone wall, and a small wooden gate, and a little path of dressed flag through the autumn beds. Clemency arrived at the Dower Cottage at 11:30 on the cold blue October morning. Mrs. Furnivall opened the gate for her and led her up the path to the door. The Dower Cottage was small and clean, a kitchen at the back with a deal table and a copper kettle on the hob, and the fire newly laid. A parlour at the front with a small fireplace and 2 plain chairs and a small oak table. A single bedchamber above with a plain bed, already made up in the park's coarse white linen by Mrs. Furnivall's own hand the previous afternoon, in case the Dower Cottage should be wanted before Christmas. A small back garden with a clipped box hedge, and an apple tree heavy with the last of the year's fruit, and a stone path to the rectory's well. Mrs. Furnivall showed her each room, plainly and without comment, pointed out the laid fire and the coal scuttle, opened the corner cupboard in the kitchen with the plain Staffordshire tea set of 6 pieces from the park, the housekeeper's own, ma'am, not the park's, if you'll forgive the liberty, set out clean upon the shelf, said she would be down again at 6 with a basket of bread and butter and a small cold pie. The rectory garden has no shop nearer than the village, ma'am, and the village shop is shut on a Saturday afternoon. And inclined to clemency at the threshold of the parlour at noon, and left her there. The Dower Cottage door closed behind Mrs. Furnivall, in the quiet of the rectory garden, with the cold blue October light coming through the small leaded window of the parlour upon the bare oak floor, and the 2 plain chairs and the small oak table. Clemency stood at the parlour window. 6 months. 6 months of her own at the Wensleydale Rectory's Dower Cottage. The peppercorn rent, paid in coin that morning, the formal written arrangement to be drawn up by Mr. Treadgold that afternoon. The London coach gone without her at 11 from Northallerton. Mrs. Pelham at Bayswater to be written to that evening, with kind thanks and steady regret. The cold blue Yorkshire October light through the leaded window. The apple tree in the small back garden with the last of the year's fruit on it. The rooks at the rectory elms, faint and far. The chime of St. Andrew's striking the half-hour afternoon over the rectory garden wall, low and faint and country clear in the cold blue air. The clipped box in the small back garden gave its small, clean winter scent through the half-open kitchen door behind her. Somewhere across the rectory beds, a robin sang its thin October note and stopped and did not sing again. She did not weep. She stood at the parlour window in plain black bombazine, hands quiet at her cuff, and looked out at the rectory garden in the cold, blue October light, and did not, in the empty parlour at the close of the morning, allow herself to feel anything she had not the steady country composure to bear. The Saturday evening of the 3rd of October, 1818, the first evening Clemency Wainwright passed at the rectory dower cottage of Wensley by the How, came in cold and blue and quiet above the rectory garden, and was the first evening of her life she had spent under any roof, not her father's. The 2 rooms had been opened and aired, and the small grate in the parlour had been laid and lit by some hand from the park kitchen during the afternoon, so that when Clemency came down from the upstairs bedchamber a little before 6, in her plain black bombazine, there was already a low steady glow in the hearth, and the kettle was singing on the hob. Mrs. Furnivall had, against Clemency's polite request that this should not be repeated, sent up a supper tray from the park kitchen at 6 o'clock, by the hand of one of the park's younger maids, a quiet country girl, who set the tray down on the parlour table and curtsied, and went away without speaking. And Clemency, understanding that this first tray was the household's settled act of welcome and was not, in the housekeeper's mind, a matter for argument upon the first evening, ate her supper at the small table by the fire. A bowl of barley broth, a slice of cold mutton, bread and butter, and a slice of plain plum cake from Mrs. Bayswater's morning batch, with a small pot of tea. When she had eaten, and had carried the tray through to the scullery, she came back into the parlour and sat down at the writing desk her father had left her, which had been carried up from the curate's cottage and set against the parlour wall beneath the window, and took out a sheet of plain writing paper and her pen, and wrote a short letter to Mrs. Pelham at Bayswater. She wrote, in her steady, plain country hand, "Dear Mrs. Pelham, I write at once to tell you that the plan upon which we had agreed, of my coming up by the Saturday mail, to take the small back room at 30 shillings the quarter, must for the present be altered. There has been, at the cottage door this morning of the 3rd, an offer from the patron of the living, the Duke of Wensleydale, of the use of the rectory's dower cottage at a peppercorn rent for the 6 months from this date, in order that I may have a quieter time in which to consider a more deliberate course than the next London coach could allow me. I have accepted upon the proper terms, with the Wensleydale family solicitor, Mr. Treadgold, present as witness, and with the park housekeeper, Mrs. Furnivall, as chaperone. I shall write again towards the end of November, when my plans for the spring are more settled. I send you, in the meantime, my steady affection and my apology for the inconvenience of the change. Your obedient and very grateful Clemency Wainwright." She sealed the letter and laid it on the corner of the desk for the Monday post, and the cottage was quiet around her, and the fire was steady in the grate, and the case clock she had brought from her father's cottage ticked low, and even in the corner, and at a little past 9 she took up her father's small Bible and read the evening psalm aloud in the small, even country voice she had read it aloud in for her father these 6 years, and then she banked the fire and trimmed the candle and went up the narrow stair to sleep. On the Tuesday afternoon, the 6th of October, 1818, at 4:30, a plain country travelling carriage, turned in at the rectory gate and drew up at the rectory door. From it descended a lady of 38, who had dark hair like her brother's, a plain country dress, and kind hazel eyes, and who was, as the rectory was informed at once, and the dower cottage at 5 o'clock, Lady Constance Crawley, born Calvert, the elder sister of the 4th Duke of Wensleydale, come up to pass the autumn at her brother's house, as she had been intending to do these 3 months past. She rested at the rectory above a cup of tea for half an hour, and then walked through the rectory garden to the dower cottage on her brother's arm, with Mrs. Furnivall a steady 3 paces behind. And at 5 o'clock the Duke presented his elder sister at the dower cottage door to Miss Clemency Wainwright. The greeting was a small, steady country greeting upon the open door, with the cold blue October light falling sideways across the threshold. Lady Constance gave Clemency her hand. Clemency, in her plain black bombazine, returned the steady country curtsy she had returned to her father's bishop. Lady Constance had brought a small, plain country basket, which she handed to Mrs. Furnivall to set down upon the parlour table, a jar of her own preserved damsons in plain glass, and a small fruit-cake wrapped in clean white linen. And she stood at the dower cottage door in the cold October light and spoke as follows. "Clemency, I beg, if it does not offend you, that I shall use your given name from this first hour. I am not a London woman, and I have no patience for the formalities of strangers when I know I shall be at the park until Christmas. I have spoken with my brother and with Mrs. Furnivall. I shall call upon you twice a week here at the dower cottage, at 4 in the afternoon for an hour, on the Tuesdays and on the Fridays, while I am at the park. We shall not press. You shall tell me if it is too much, and we shall make it once a week, or once a fortnight, or not at all. You are not under any of our hands." Clemency, after the small composed silence of a woman who had been addressed plainly by a woman of plain country breeding, answered in the steady country voice that had answered her father's bishop. "Lady Constance, I thank you. The Tuesday and the Friday at 4 will suit me very well. I shall not be at the dower cottage on the 3 afternoons your brother has proposed I should read in the South Library, but on the Tuesday and the Friday at 4 I shall be here." Lady Constance inclined and went away with her brother through the rectory garden in the cold blue October light, and Mrs. Furnivall came in to put the damsons and the fruit-cake in the parlour cupboard. And the dower cottage was quiet again, with the small steady fire and the small steady clock and the October light falling sideways through the parlour window onto the bare clean boards of the floor. On the Wednesday morning, the 7th of October, Mrs. Furnivall came down to the dower cottage at 10 o'clock with a folded note from the Duke. The note proposed, upon the proper terms and with the housekeeper as chaperone, that Clemency should come up to the park 3 afternoons a week, on the Monday, the Wednesday, and the Friday, from 3 o'clock until 4:30, to read in the South Library. The Duke would be present at his writing table at the end of the long room, attending to his estate business, and Mrs. Furnivall would be present at the door with her sewing. The reading should be from any book of Clemency's own choosing, taken from the South Library's shelves or from her father's 3 boxes as she pleased. No wage should attach to the arrangement, the £30 a year of her father's annuity being the proper securing of her independence, and the use of the South Library being, upon the Duke's part, the plain gift of a patron to a curate's daughter who had been left without a place to read. Clemency read the note through twice in the steady country lamplight, as she had read the inventory through twice at her father's writing desk on the 18th of September. And after the small composed silence of a woman who weighed what was offered against what was proper, she took up her pen at her father's writing desk and answered upon a half-sheet of plain paper in the steady plain country hand, "Your Grace, I accept upon the terms you have set down. I shall be at the South Library at 3 upon the Monday, the Wednesday, and the Friday, with Mrs. Furnivall, and shall read from my own choice of book. I thank you. Clemency Wainwright. The reading began that same Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock in the South Library at Wensleydale Park. The South Library was a long, quiet room of dark oak with 3 tall sash windows looking south across the home park and a small marble hearth at the further end. The Duke's writing table was set in the bay of the centre window, his estate papers ranged upon it in plain, steady piles. Mrs. Furnivall had her sewing chair set near the door. Clemency, in her plain black bombazine, sat in the small reading chair beside the marble hearth, with the first volume of Cowper's Task open upon her lap. She had chosen it from her father's box that morning, because it had been one of the first books her father had ever set into her hand. She read the first book of the Task aloud in the steady, plain country voice that had read aloud at her father's evening fire these 6 years, with the slow, even pace and the small, careful pauses at the turn of each line. The Duke at his writing table with his pen steady upon his estate papers, Mrs. Furnivall at her sewing by the door. The long, pale October light moving slowly along the dark oak floor. When the first book was finished, a little past 4, Clemency closed the volume upon her lap and set it down on the small table beside the chair, and the Duke laid down his pen and sat back in his chair at the writing table and spoke in the quiet, steady country voice she had heard him speak in at the parlour of the curate's cottage 4 mornings before. Miss Wainwright, I had not heard Cowper read aloud since I was 12. My late mother had been a great reader of him. She had read him aloud to me of an evening at this fire, in this room before her illness. I thank you. Clemency answered in the steady, plain country voice. Your Grace, my father had loved Cowper. He had said that no man who had loved his garden could be wholly wrong in his book. Severin inclined slowly at the writing table and took up his pen again, and the room was quiet about them. On the Friday afternoon, the 9th of October, when she had read the second book of the Task, he asked her, quite plainly across the long room, whether she would object to his asking whether her father had been a great gardener. She said that he had been a steady country gardener, with a small kitchen garden behind the curate's cottage of plain root crops and a few flower beds at the south wall, that he had kept hollyhocks and Michaelmas daisies and a single old white rose against the south wall that had been her mother's, and that the parish gardener at the curate's cottage would, she trusted, keep the rose. Severin inclined and said, Mr. Hesketh shall keep the rose. I shall speak to him on the Monday morning. Clemency answered, I thank you, Your Grace. And the room was quiet again. On the Monday afternoon of the 12th, when she had read the third book of the Task, Severin laid down his pen and asked her, in the steady, plain country voice across the long room, whether the writing of the inventory at the curate's cottage had been hard upon her. Clemency answered that it had been less hard than the funeral the Tuesday following, that her father had been clear-headed to the last and had told her, the Wednesday evening before he died, what was in the deed box and what Mr. Treadgold would have to do, that she'd been ready upon the morning of the 18th and had read the inventory through twice and had set it down with a hand that did not tremble. Severin inclined. Miss Wainwright, I shall not press you upon it again. Clemency answered, Your Grace, you may ask of him whatever you please. I shall always answer. On the Wednesday of the 14th of October, Sir Hereward Crawley came up from the East Riding in his own plain country travelling chaise, with soft sandy hair, a country gentleman in a plain dark green coat, to spend a fortnight at his brother-in-law's house at the autumn shooting. He met Clemency upon the Wednesday evening in the park's drawing-room, before dinner with a steady, plain country bow. Miss Wainwright, I am very glad to know you. My wife has spoken of you these 3 days. Across that fortnight, the 4 of them, Severin, Lady Constance, Sir Hereward, and Clemency, dined 3 times together at the park on the Wednesday and the Saturday and the Tuesday following. and upon each of those evenings Clemency went back to the dower cottage at 9:30 by the park's plain country lantern, with Mrs. Furnivall walking 3 paces behind her through the rectory garden, and slept that night on her own settled principle beneath the dower cottage roof, and not beneath the park's. The household of the park adjusted itself to the new arrangement without fuss. Mr. Quennell, white-haired, in a plain black butler's coat, 31 years in service, set Clemency's place at the long dining table 2 seats down upon the Duke's right, and Mrs. Bayswater, soft grey-brown hair beneath the linen cap, warm, pale eyes, sent down to the dower cottage upon each Monday morning a plain country basket of bread and butter and cold mutton, and a small fruit cake from the park's morning batch. On the Friday afternoon of the 16th of October, in the South Library, with Mrs. Furnivall sewing at the door, Severin asked Clemency plainly across the long room about Joanna Whitley. He asked what she had been like at the Howe County Assembly of August 1816, how she had died, how Clemency had managed the 3 years and a half since. Clemency, in the small reading chair beside the marble hearth, with the closed volume of Cowper upon her lap, answered in the steady, plain country voice. She said that Joanna had been 4 years the elder, that she had married Mr. Whitley at the parish church in August 1814, and had gone to live with him at Howe, that she had been brought to bed of a stillborn child on the 4th of December 1815, and had died of the childbed fever 6 hours after, that Mr. Whitley had gone to London the next spring and had not married again, that she, Clemency, had been 23 at Joanna's death, and had kept house for her father from the day she came home from Howe. Severin inclined. Miss Wainwright, I had known the elder of you a little at the assembly. I am sorry. Clemency answered, Your Grace, I thank you. On the Friday of the 30th of October, in the South Library with Mrs. Furnivall sewing at the door, Clemency asked the Duke plainly across the long room about Lady Marjorie Calvert. She asked when she had been married and when she had died. Severin laid down his pen and answered plainly that he had married Lady Marjorie in May 1810 when she was 24 and he was 28, that she had taken a quick fever in the cold January of 1813 and had died upon the 11th of that month, that there had been no children of the marriage, that he had not, in the 5 years since, looked at any other woman with any settled intent, but had kept the small black piping at his cuff to the present day. Clemency answered, Your Grace, I thank you for telling me. On the Monday afternoon of the 16th of November, in the South Library, with Mrs. Furnivall sewing at the door, they spoke of nothing in particular for half an hour. Clemency had been reading from the 4th book of the Task, and had laid the volume aside at the turn of a page. Severin had laid down his pen on the small estate letter he had been answering, and had spoken of the Home Farm's hay yield for the year, and of the small flooding that the Home Farm's South Brook had taken in the wet autumn of 1816, and of the parish bridge over the Howe at the foot of the Home Park. Clemency answered of the small, steady country things she knew of the parish from her father's 6 years in the curacy, and the half-hour passed slowly, the case clock above the marble hearth striking the half. They had, by this third small careful conversation in the South Library, found the small steady rhythm of 2 people who had each lost the same kind of person at different removes, she her sister these 3 years, and her father these 2 months, he his wife these 5 years, and his mother these many years before, and had each learned, by long steady country use, what was proper to ask of the other, and what was not. On the Sunday morning of the 22nd of November 1818, in the cold blue Yorkshire November light, the parish gathered at St. Andrew's, Wensley by the Howe, for the morning service by the Reverend Carlyon. The whole parish was in, the farm families of the Home Farm, the rectory's household, the household of Wensleydale Park, Mr. Treadgold up from Northallerton for the day, the parish ladies in their plain country bonnets, the parish children quiet in the back pews. The Duke of Wensleydale sat in the family pew at the front of the church with his sister Lady Constance and Sir Hereward. Clemency sat in the second pew in her plain black bombazine with Mrs. Furnivall at her side. After the service, when the parish had gone, its slow, steady country way out of the churchyard and along the lane, the Duke walked Clemency back through the rectory garden to the dower cottage. Lady Constance had gone on ahead with Mr. Quennell to the park. Mrs. Furnivall walked her steady 3 paces behind. The rectory garden in the cold blue November light was bare of flowers, the box hedges trimmed back hard for the winter, the small kitchen garden cleared, the last apples gone from the small orchard at the south wall, and the brown brick path crisp with frost beneath their steady country boots. He did not press. He did not propose. He walked her steadily along the brick path between the bare box hedges, in the cold blue November light, in the quiet country quarter hour after the parish service, and at 12:15 he stopped at the dower cottage door. He inclined deeply over her hand. He said, "Miss Wainwright, I wish you a steady afternoon." He went away through the rectory garden in the cold blue November light without looking back. Clemency took her cold Sunday luncheon at the small parlour table at 1 o'clock, cold mutton from the park kitchen, a slice of plain country bread, a small portion of Lady Constance's preserved damsons in a small plain dish, and did not, this Sunday, take out her writing paper to write to Mrs. Pelham at Bayswater. She sat at the small parlour table, by the small steady fire in the cold blue Sunday afternoon, with the case clock ticking low and even in the corner, and turned the 8 weeks behind her, slowly in her steady, plain country mind. She had set out upon the morning of the 3rd of October to go up by the London mail to a Bayswater back room at 30 shillings the quarter, with her 3 boxes and her writing desk and her £30 a year, to seek a small music teaching post for the spring. She had not, in any imagination of those 8 weeks, expected what they had become. She did not know what she expected of December. She did not know what the Duke expected of December. She had £30 a year, and her father's 3 boxes of books, and a 2-room cottage in the rectory garden at a peppercorn rent for the 6 months to the 3rd of April 1819. She had, in the South Library 3 afternoons a week, the steady plain country company of a man who had not, in the 8 weeks since the cottage door of the 3rd of October, once pressed his case beyond the proper bounds of the standing benevolence clause he had set down before Mr. Treadgold on that first morning, who had remembered her face from a Howe assembly 2 years before, and had not, in 8 weeks of slow, steady country reading, once spoken of it again, who had asked plainly of Joanna, and had told plainly of Lady Marjorie, and had not, on the Sunday walk back from St. Andrew's at 12:15, said any word that was not proper to be said. She was content, this Sunday at 1 o'clock, at the small parlour table of the dower cottage at Wensley by the Howe, with not knowing. On the cold, pale blue morning of Tuesday, the 1st of December, 1818, at 11:30 of the clock, a hired post-chaise of the common Yorkshire pattern, the off-side lamp cracked, drew up the great gravel sweep at Wensleydale Park, and stopped at the foot of the south portico. Mr. Quennell went out to the portico, and saw, descending from the post-chaise, a gentleman of 49, Sir Aloysius Bramble, florid, oily primrose waistcoat slightly stained at the lower button, quizzing-glass on a black ribbon, came up the steps and presented a card upon which his name was printed in copperplate beneath the address of a London club. He had not been written down upon the standing morning list of the park, nor had any letter come up from the Northallerton bag that morning to give his Grace warning. He had come, in plain terms, uninvited. Sir Aloysius said, in a voice that had the oily round vowels of the London clubs upon it, that he had come from town upon a family matter, and had a letter from a London solicitor that the Duke should see. Mr. Quennell took the card and the letter upon the small silver salver and bore them to the morning room, where His Grace was at the standing morning estate papers with Mr. Treadgold, who had come up from North Allerton at 10 upon the standing Tuesday matters. Mr. Quennell announced Sir Aloysius Bramble of London, come down upon a family matter with a letter. Severin took the card and read it through once, and read the direction of the letter beneath it, and set them both down upon the writing-table. He did not, at the small, mean impertinence of an uninvited London cousin, alter his face. He inclined to Mr. Quennell. "Mr. Quennell, show Sir Aloysius into the morning-room. Mr. Treadgold shall sit with me." Mr. Quennell inclined and went out, and presently returned with Sir Aloysius Bramble, who came in with the small, oily, forward step of a man who had rehearsed his speech upon the road up from North Allerton. Severin rose, and inclined once. "Sir Aloysius, Mr. Treadgold of Treadgold, and Sons of North Allerton, my family solicitor, is with me. You may state your business in his hearing." Sir Aloysius inclined, more deeply than the occasion required, and put up his quizzing-glass to glance at Mr. Treadgold once. He cleared his throat and spoke. "Your Grace, I have heard the most extraordinary thing at White's this past month, namely that you have settled a small piece of land, a 4-acre cottage and garden adjacent to the Wensleydale home farm, upon a country curate's daughter at Wensley by the How, without the consent of the Welbeck trustees, my late cousin, Lady Marjorie, having been the daughter of the 8th Baron Welbeck, and the 4 acres in question being arguably Welbeckside property held in tail-mail. I have come down, in family duty, to lay before you the position of the Welbeck trustees, and to ask, with all proper deference, that the settlement be revisited." Severin heard him out, without altering his face. He inclined to Mr. Treadgold. "Mr. Treadgold, Sir Aloysius has stated his business. You may set out the position." Mr. Treadgold, in the thin scholarly voice of a man who had drawn the Wensleydale deeds for 22 years, rose from his chair and drew from his client's ledger the leather-bound book of the Wensleydale settled estate, and opened it at the Hollygate Cottage entry, and read, "Sir Aloysius, the 4-acre piece in question, Hollygate Cottage and its garden, half a mile north of the park upon the North Allerton Road, is part of the Calvert-side Wensleydale settled estate in tail-mail, descending from the 2nd Duke through the 3rd Duke to the present 4th Duke. It is not in any sense Welbeckside property. The settlement of the 4 acres upon Miss Clemency Wainwright is therefore wholly within the present Duke's absolute power of disposition. The Welbeck trustees have no interest in the matter, and no consent of theirs is required, and none has been asked. Your application, in plain terms, has no foundation in fact." Sir Aloysius blustered. He said, in the oily round vowels of his London Club speech, that any piece of land at Wensleydale adjacent to the home farm must be presumed at the first instance to be Welbeckside property, and that the Welbeck trustees were of the firm opinion. Mr. Treadgold did not raise his voice. He took up the letter that Sir Aloysius had brought down. He read the direction. He read the signature. He set the letter back down. "Sir Aloysius, this letter which you have brought down from London this morning, and presented at His Grace's door as the formal opinion of the Welbeck family solicitor, is not in fact from a Welbeck family solicitor at all. It is from one Mr. Pinchbeck of Furnival's Inn, a junior practitioner of 2 years' standing at the bar, and widely known to take cases on credit for clients of your own particular standing. The Welbeck family solicitor is Mr. Allardyce of Lincoln's Inn, and Mr. Allardyce has not, to the certain knowledge of this office, drawn any opinion upon the Hollygate 4 acres, nor has he been instructed to do so, nor is it within the proper office of his client, trustees, to instruct him upon a piece of land that is not, in any particular, Welbeckside property." Sir Aloysius coloured. He held his quizzing-glass at his eye, for a long, oily moment without speaking. He said, in a voice that had lost a measure of its London club polish, that there must surely, in family courtesy, be some accommodation that Severin did not let him finish. He inclined once in the 4-sentence form. Sir Aloysius, Mr. Treadgold has set out the position. The 4-acre settlement is within my absolute power and is not subject to the Welbeck trustees in any particular. Your application has no foundation. Mr. Quennell shall show you out, and I shall be obliged if you do not call upon me at Wensleydale again upon this or any other family matter. Sir Aloysius blustered once more, that he had come in family duty, that the matter would be raised in town. Severin did not answer. He rang the small silver bell upon the writing-table. Mr. Quennell came in at the steady country pace of a butler who had heard the bell at the corridor end. He inclined. "Mr. Quennell, show Sir Aloysius out. He shall not call upon me again at Wensleydale." Mr. Quennell inclined, and stood with the door held open. Sir Aloysius, his colour high, gathered up his hat and greatcoat and went out. The hired post-chaise drove away down the great gravel sweep at 12 minutes past noon. Severin inclined to Mr. Treadgold. "Mr. Treadgold, the deed for Miss Wainwright, which you had drawn up 3 weeks since, we shall complete it. You shall bring it up upon Saturday the 12th at 3 o'clock for the signing in the South Library. Mrs. Furnivall and Mr. Quennell shall witness." Mr. Treadgold inclined, closed the leather-bound book, and returned to the standing Tuesday rents. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the cold pale blue light beginning to draw in at the South Library window upon the Tuesday 3 o'clock reading hour, Clemency Wainwright came up the long corridor of the east wing on her standing Tuesday office, having walked from the rectory dower cottage through the rectory garden and the South Park gate in her plain black bombazine and her plain black country bonnet, and took her place at the small reading chair beside the marble hearth. Mrs. Furnivall came in at the door with her sewing basket, and took her standing chair beside the door, and set her work upon her knee, and did not raise her head. Severin was at his writing-table at the long south window, with the standing Tuesday afternoon estate papers before him. He set them aside upon Clemency's coming in. He inclined to Mrs. Furnivall. He inclined to Clemency. He spoke plainly, in the steady country voice of a man who had decided, between noon and 3, that the small mean noise of the London clubs should not reach the dower cottage by a parish whisper, but by his own steady voice at his own South Library hearth. "Miss Wainwright, there was a London cousin of my late wife's at the park this morning. The matter has no foundation. Mr. Treadgold has it in hand. I had not, in any of my proper offices in your case, intended to trouble you with the small mean noise of the London clubs. I tell you of it now only because the small mean noise may reach you by some other route, and I had rather you heard of it from my own voice than from a parish whisper at the village pump." Clemency heard him out. She did not, in any small country movement, interrupt. She did not raise her hand to the small mourning locket at her plain black throat. She did not look at Mrs. Furnivall sewing by the door. She looked at Severin at the writing-table at the south window, and she heard the steady country voice through to its proper finish. After a long composed silence, perhaps 40 seconds of the small ticking of the marble hearth clock, she spoke, plainly, in her steady country voice. "Your Grace, what had you been minded to do with the 4 acres before Mr. Bramble had come down?" Severin, after a small composed silence of his own, perhaps 10 seconds no more, answered her plainly. He did not, in the answering, alter his face or his voice. He set his hands upon the standing estate papers at the writing-table. "Miss Wainwright, I had been minded, and had set Mr. Treadgold to drawing up the deed 3 weeks since, to settle them upon you, so that you might have a small income from your own land beyond the £30 a year of your annuity. The cottage at Hollygate is in repair. The 4 acres are good arable land, let at present to Peter Pickering at £40 a year. The income from the let, after the standing parish charges and the standing tithe and the standing rate, is at present £36 a year clear. Clemency heard him through. She did not, at the figure named, £36 a year clear, in addition to the 30 of the annuity, make any small country exclamation. She did not raise her eyes from the small composed clasp of her hands upon her lap. She drew in one steady country breath. She let it out. She spoke. "Your Grace, I have not asked for this. I have not, at any of the 7 Wednesday afternoons I have read Cowper aloud at this fire, asked you for any consideration beyond the 6-month dower cottage arrangement of October, and I had not intended to ask you for any consideration thereafter. I had supposed, when I accepted the dower cottage on the 3rd of October, that the standing benevolence clause of the Wensleydale estate had a strict and proper limit upon it. A 4-acre settlement is beyond any standing benevolence clause." Severin heard her out. He did not, at the steady country refusal of any small forward suggestion, alter his face. He inclined once, to acknowledge that he had heard. He spoke plainly. "I know it. The settlement is not made upon the standing benevolence clause. The settlement is made upon my own absolute power, and upon my own absolute wish, and upon my own private acknowledgement that I had given your late father, through 3 years of approving his quarterly returns to Mr. Treadgold, a less generous consideration than the steadiness of his curacy at Wensley had deserved. The £36 a year you should have from the Hollygate let is, in plain terms, a debt I owed your father, and shall now pay to his daughter. The deed stands. You may use the land, or sell the land, or rent the land as you choose. The 4 acres are yours." Clemency did not speak for nearly 2 full minutes. Mrs. Furnivall, at her standing chair beside the door, sewed in the small, even country rhythm of a housekeeper of 28 years in service at the park, and did not, at any point in the long composed silence, raise her head from her work. The fire ticked on the marble hearth. The cold, pale blue late afternoon light at the south window thinned by a small country measure as the silence ran on. Clemency inclined once, in the small composed gravity of a country curate's daughter who had heard the steady country voice of the Duke of Wensleydale through to its proper finish and had taken the full measure of it. She spoke. "Your Grace, I shall accept the deed. I shall not, however, accept it as a debt owed by your Grace to my late father, which I am persuaded is a more generous fiction than the case will bear. I shall accept it as the settlement of the patron of the Wensleydale, living upon the orphaned daughter of his late curate, of which there is documentary precedent in the parish records as far back as 1734, and which the standing benevolence clause does not strictly cover, but does in spirit recognise. Mr. Treadgold may draw up the deed upon that footing." Severin inclined deeply. He did not, at the small composed correction of his own preferred footing, contest the substitution. He had set the 4 acres down upon a plate at her hand. She had taken the plate up upon her own terms. The 4 acres were settled. He inclined a second time, more shallowly, as a man inclines who has been answered properly and accepts the answer. "Miss Wainwright, upon that footing. Mr. Treadgold shall draw the deed upon that footing. Mrs. Furnivall and Mr. Quennell shall witness on Saturday the 12th at 3 o'clock." The matter, in the steady country office of a South Library writing table on a cold pale blue 1st of December, was settled. Clemency picked up the volume of Cowper from the small reading-chair table beside her. At the page she had marked the previous Wednesday with the small narrow strip of paper from her father's writing desk. She read. Severin returned to his standing Tuesday afternoon estate papers at the writing table at the south window. Mrs. Furnivall sewed at her standing chair beside the door. The fire ticked on the marble hearth. The cold, pale blue light at the south window drew in by the slow, steady measure of a Yorkshire December afternoon. The Wednesday afternoon, for the following day, was a Wednesday, and clemency came up upon her standing 3 times a week office at 3 o'clock, passed in its accustomed rhythm. Cowper at the marked page, Severin at the standing papers, Mrs. Furnival at the door with her sewing, the fire on the marble hearth. On Saturday the 12th of December, at 3 o'clock, Mr. Treadgold came up from Northallerton through a cold, pale blue, early winter afternoon with the deed in his client's satchel, the parchment drawn fair upon vellum, and the seals of red wax already affixed at the proper several places. He came into the South Library at the standing Tuesday and Saturday hour. Severin was at the writing table at the south window. Clemency had come up from the rectory dower cottage at 2:30 and had taken her place at the small reading chair beside the marble hearth. Mrs. Furnival stood at her standing chair beside the door. Mr. Quennell, who had been sent for from the front hall, came in upon Mr. Treadgold's heel and took his stand at the second witness place beside the writing table. Mr. Treadgold laid the deed upon the writing table. He read out the principal clauses. The 4 acres of Hollygate Cottage and its garden, 1/2 mile north of the park, upon the Northallerton Road, settled upon Miss Clemency Wainwright in fee simple, the present tenancy of Peter Pickering at £40 a year, continuing under the standing parish charges and the standing tithe and the standing rate, the net income to the settled estate of £36 a year clear, the settlement made upon the footing of the patron of the Wensleydale, living upon the orphaned daughter of his late curate, after the documentary precedent in the parish records. Clemency rose from the small reading chair. She came to the writing table. She took the pen from Mr. Treadgold's hand. She signed Clemency Wainwright in the small upright country hand of a curate's daughter, who had been her father's parish clerk these 6 years past, and had signed the parish registers in his stead at Easter and Michaelmas of 1817 and 1818. Severin took the pen from her hand. He signed Wensleydale in the steady country hand of a man who had borne the ducal title nearly 5 years, and had set it down upon the standing settlement deeds of the Wensleydale estate at every proper several occasion. Mrs. Furnival came forward from her standing chair. She took the pen. She signed Eliza Furnival, housekeeper, in the small, steady housekeeper's hand of a woman who had served at the park since 1890 and had witnessed 3 previous Calvertside settlements at the same South Library writing table. Mr. Quennell came forward from his stand beside the table. He took the pen. He signed William Quennell, butler. Mr. Treadgold pressed the final red wax seal at the foot of the deed with the small, steady solicitor's iron of his Northallerton office. The deed was sealed. The 4 acres of Hollygate Cottage were formally settled upon Miss Clemency Wainwright in fee simple on Saturday the 12th of December, 1818, at 16 minutes past 3 of the clock. On the morning of Sunday the 13th of December, at 11 o'clock, the parish of Wensley by the How gathered at St. Andrew's Parish Church for the standing morning service. The Reverend Carlyon, in his plain black country cassock, preached steadily and plainly upon the duty of charity, taking his text from the 25th chapter of Matthew at verses 35 and 36. For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was a stranger, and ye took me in, and ye clothed me. And dwelling in the small, steady country gravity of a rector of 23 years, standing in the parish, upon the proper office of a Christian neighbour, at the season of the year, when the cold, pale blue light drew in early, and the lodging of strangers was the standing duty of the parish. He had not, at any point in the steady country drawing of his sermon, been told of the Hollygate settlement of the previous afternoon at the South Library writing table. The parish, however, knew. The parish had known by Saturday evening, Mr. Pickering at Hollygate having walked down to the Wensley village pump at 5:30 upon his standing Saturday office, and having said in the small country gravity of a tenant farmer who had been told that afternoon by Mr. Treadgold of Treadgold and Sons of his new landlady, that Miss Wainwright at the Rectory Dower Cottage was, upon a deed signed and sealed at the park that day, the new owner in fee simple of his 4 acres and his cottage and his garden. After the morning service at 3 o'clock of the cold, pale blue Sunday afternoon, the parish ladies came in their 3 particular turns to call upon clemency at the Rectory Dower Cottage. Mrs. Carter of the Old Hall came first at the steady country office of a parish lady of long standing, and offered, in the small composed gravity of a woman who had not in September offered the winter's lodging that the case had asked for, the use of her own east bedchamber at the Old Hall, through to Lady Day if Miss Wainwright should care to take it. Mrs. Lambton of Lambton Grange came second at 3:30, and offered, in a similar country gravity, a similar winter's lodging at the Grange. Lady Pickering of the Pickering Hall came third at 4 o'clock, and offered, in a similar country gravity, a similar arrangement at her own house. Clemency, in her steady country composure, received each in her turn in the small front parlour of the Rectory Dower Cottage. She thanked each, properly, without small country reproach for the September that none of them had offered the lodging then, and declined each, the standing 6-month Dower Cottage arrangement of the 3rd of October being sufficient, and the Hollygate settlement of the previous afternoon having altered, in any case, the proper terms upon which the question stood. The parish ladies departed at 5. Clemency sat at the small mahogany writing desk at the south parlour window in the failing cold, pale blue late afternoon light. She did not raise her hand to the small mourning locket at her plain black throat. She had, on the 3rd of October, a £30 annuity and 3 boxes and her father's small Sheffield plate. She had, on the 13th of December, the same £30 annuity, the same 3 boxes, the same small Sheffield plate, and 4 acres of Hollygate Cottage, with its garden in fee simple, let to Peter Pickering at £40 a year, clear of 36 after the parish charges. The standing 6-month Dower Cottage arrangement ran on through to the 3rd of April. The Hollygate settlement, signed and sealed and witnessed at the South Library writing table the previous afternoon, ran on without end, the 4 acres being settled upon her in fee simple from the present day. The London rumour reached Wensleydale upon a hard-frosted afternoon of the 3rd week of December, 1818, in the form of a back-kitchen conversation overheard by Mr. Quennell in the servants' passage at 4:30 o'clock upon the Wednesday before Christmas Eve. The footman speaking was a young man named Wilson, who had returned the previous evening from London, where he had been sent on a fortnight's errand of plate cleaning at the Wensleydale Hill Street house in Mayfair. Wilson was telling the undercook at the scullery sink what he had heard from a footman of Lord Sefton's house in Arlington Street upon the Saturday previous. And what the Sefton footman had heard from a fellow at White's was that Sir Aloysius Bramble had been telling, in the coffee-room at White's, the story of how the present Duke of Wensleydale had been compromising a country curate's daughter at his Yorkshire seat in a 4-acre arrangement of suspect character. Mr. Quennell halted in the passage. He heard the sentence through twice, and then he stepped into the back kitchen and said, "Wilson, a word, if you please." He had the boy in the butler's pantry within the half-minute. He ascertained that Wilson had not repeated the story save once to his own brother, at the Northallerton coach stop on the previous Monday morning. He charged the boy to repeat it nowhere further. Then he went up the back stairs to Mrs. Furnival's sitting room at 5 o'clock and laid the matter before her in 11 sentences, without expression. Mrs. Furnival set down her sewing. She said, "Mr. Quennell, I shall speak to her ladyship before supper. I shall not speak to his grace until her ladyship has done so." Mr. Quennell inclined. Mrs. Furnivall went up to Lady Constance's small sitting room upon the first floor at 5:30, with the linen press inspection book under her arm, the inspection being an inspection of the household sheets and pillowcases for the Christmas fortnight. She laid the book upon the writing table and said that Wilson had returned from London with a piece of club-room talk that her ladyship had best hear before her brother heard it. Lady Constance listened through. She set down her pen. She said, "Mrs. Furnivall, I am obliged. I shall speak to my brother upon Christmas morning after the service, and not before." Mrs. Furnivall inclined. Christmas Eve passed quietly at the park. The carol singers from the village came up at 7 o'clock and were given hot spiced ale at the great hall door. Mrs. Bayswater had the Christmas pies ready by 10. The household retired by 11. Christmas morning, Friday the 25th of December, the family went down to St. Andrew's at 10:30 for the service. Reverend Carlyon preached upon the second chapter of St. Luke for 20 minutes. The parish sang 2 carols, and at 12:15, Lady Constance walked with her brother in the South Park, 3 paces aside from the gravel path, and laid Mrs. Furnivall's report before him in 7 sentences in her plain, quiet voice. Severin Calvert listened through without interrupting. He stood at the South Park balustrade, looking out across the frosted south lawn, for a small, composed silence of perhaps 15 seconds. Then he said, in his steady, cold composure, "Constance, I shall not, on the strength of a London rumour, dignify Sir Aloysius's club-room speech with a London reply. I shall ask, however, that you should go up to town in the first weeks of January and set the matter publicly straight in 3 drawing-rooms, as you set Sir Quintus straight 2 summers ago over Cousin Beatrice's elopement." Lady Constance inclined. She said, "Severin, I shall go up on the 8th. I shall be 3 weeks in town. I shall call upon Lady Sefton upon the Saturday following, upon the Duchess of Devonshire upon the Wednesday after, and upon the Countess Spencer upon the 2nd Friday. I shall set it straight in 3 sentences in each drawing-room." Severin inclined. The village Christmas dinner was served in the great hall at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as it had been served upon every Christmas Day at Wensleydale Park since the 2nd Duke's grandfather's time. 60 of the parish came. Mrs. Bayswater had a baron of beef, 4 geese, 3 boiled hams, a great sweet plum pudding, and bowls of mince pies. Mr. Quennell carved. Severin moved among the tables for the half-hour. The parish sat down at 3. They were finished by 5:30. They had walked back down to the village by 6. Clemency Wainwright, by Reverend Carlyon's standing invitation, took her Christmas dinner at the rectory with the rector and his wife. The invitation rested upon Reverend Carlyon's old undergraduate friendship of 40 years standing with her late father, from Christ's College, Cambridge. The rector had stood Hollis Wainwright's friend at Wensley by the How through the 4 years of the curacy. Clemency walked down to the village by the rectory path at 1:15, dined at 2:30 on a small goose and a baked apple pudding, sat in the rectory parlour with Mrs. Carlyon over the tea things at 5, and walked back up to the Dower Cottage by lantern at 8 o'clock, with the rector's manservant carrying the lantern 3 paces in front. The night was hard frosted and clear. She let herself into the Dower Cottage at 20 minutes past 8, banked the fire in the small parlour, and went up to bed at 9. Lady Constance Crawley went up to town from Wensleydale Park upon Friday the 8th of January, 1819, in the Wensleydale travelling coach with 2 outriders, leaving the park at 6 in the morning and reaching Hill Street, Mayfair, upon the evening of Saturday the 9th. She was to be in town 3 weeks. Sir Hereward Crawley, declining the journey on account of a touch of the gout he had taken before Christmas, remained at Wensleydale with his brother-in-law. The Hill Street house was opened up by the standing skeleton staff upon her ladyship's arrival. Fires were lit in the drawing-rooms and her ladyship's bedchamber. The Hill Street cook produced a plain mutton and rice supper at 9. Upon the Saturday following her arrival, being the 16th of January, Lady Constance called in the afternoon upon Lady Sefton in Arlington Street at the morning visiting hour of 3 o'clock. She sat with Lady Sefton in Lady Sefton's front drawing room for the regular 20 minutes. In the course of the visit, she said, in 3 plain sentences delivered without colour or emphasis, that the 4-acre settlement at the Wensleydale Home Farm, at a piece of ground called Hollygate, was on the patron's standing parish benevolence precedent of 1734 forward in favour of an orphaned curate's daughter, drawn up by Mr. Treadgold of Northallerton upon the Wensleydale estate's tail-mail land, in which the Welbeck trustees had no interest of any kind, that Sir Aloysius Bramble had no Welbeck side claim upon the 4 acres, and that his Furnival's inn solicitor, a Mr. Pinchbeck, had no standing in any London court to file a chancery bill upon the matter, and that Miss Wainwright was presently resident at the Rectory Dower Cottage at Wensley by the How at a peppercorn rent for 6 months, under Mrs. Furnival's settled household chaperonage, and the suggestion of impropriety was a London clubroom fiction without basis in the parish. Lady Sefton inclined. She had not, she said, much credited the story. She should now, she said, give it no further credit at all. Upon the Wednesday after, being the 20th of January, Lady Constance called upon the Duchess of Devonshire in Piccadilly at the morning visiting hour of 3 o'clock, and sat with her Grace in her Grace's small back drawing-room for the regular 20 minutes, and laid the 3 sentences again. The Duchess of Devonshire inclined. She remarked that Sir Aloysius Bramble had not been received in her drawing-room in 2 years on account of an earlier matter of cards, and that she should now make it known that he was not to be received at all. Upon the 2nd Friday, being the 29th of January, Lady Constance called upon the Countess Spencer in St. George's Place at the morning visiting hour of 3 o'clock, and sat with her ladyship in her ladyship's front drawing-room for the regular 20 minutes, and laid the 3 sentences again. The Countess Spencer inclined. She remarked that the Countess Spencer had known the 3rd Duke of Wensleydale upon terms of close acquaintance through 40 years, and the 3rd Duke's son she esteemed as her own son's friend, and the matter should be set straight in any drawing-room she should sit in for the rest of the season. By the close of the last week of January, the 3 drawing-rooms having spoken to perhaps 30 drawing-rooms further within the 7 days, the matter was publicly set straight in town. Sir Aloysius Bramble found himself, on the Saturday morning of the 30th of January, unwelcome in the coffee-room at White's, where he had told the story in the first week of December. The steward at the door inclined and remarked that the committee had under present consideration a small private matter touching Sir Aloysius's conduct. Sir Aloysius retired from the club within the quarter hour and did not return. He withdrew to his Berkshire place at Bramble Hall upon the Tuesday following, the 2nd of February, and was not in town again for the season. The London rumour, as London rumours do when the next month's rumour comes up, collapsed inside the month. Mr. Treadgold, upon Severin's quiet standing instruction issued upon the 7th of December, had made through the same January a separate inquiry through a London agent of his, named Mr. Hadley of Gray's Inn, into Sir Aloysius Bramble's circumstances. The agent's report came up to Northallerton upon Saturday the 6th of February, and was brought up to Wensleydale Park by Mr. Treadgold himself upon the Monday morning at 11 o'clock in the morning-room. Mr. Treadgold read the report aloud in 3 plain paragraphs. Sir Aloysius Bramble had at the present hour gambling debts of £5,400 owed to a Mr. Crockford of Pall Mall, contracted between October and November of the previous autumn. Mr. Pinchbeck of Furnival's Inn had been paid no fee whatever in the Wensleydale 4-acre matter, and had told Mr. Hadley's clerk plainly upon the 11th of January that he should not be filing a chancery bill upon any such case without a fee paid in advance, which fee was unlikely to be forthcoming. The Bramble Berkshire Place at Bramble Hall, comprising the house and 350 acres, was mortgaged to 2/3 of its present value to a Mr. Drummond of Mayfair against the previous autumn's gambling losses. Severin read the report through once in his steady silence. He laid it upon the morning-room table. He said, "Mr. Treadgold, I am obliged. I shall not act upon the report. The matter is closed." Mr. Treadgold inclined and took the report away. The cold of January and February at Wensleydale set in hard. The frost held from the 7th of January through to the 20th of February, with snow upon the high moor and a thin crust of ice upon the village ponds. The dower cottage in the rectory garden, being a small 2-room single-flue building intended for a summer's residence in the late Dowager Rector's time, was unheatable in a hard frost. Clemency Wainwright, upon her £30 a year, had not the budget for sufficient coal to keep both the parlour fire and the bedchamber fire alight through the 4 winter months. Lady Constance, returning from town to Wensleydale Park upon Monday the 1st of February, drove down to the dower cottage upon the Tuesday afternoon, found Clemency at the parlour writing desk in her plain black bombazine, with her hands chilled and her ink half frozen, and proposed in 3 plain sentences delivered without colour or emphasis that Clemency should remove for the worst of the winter weather, at her ladyship's particular request, into the small east wing bedchamber at the park. That Mrs. Furnivall should arrange the matter that very afternoon, and that the dower cottage should be retained at the peppercorn rent, and used by Clemency for daylight hours each day, the arrangement to run until the cold weather broke. Clemency, after a small composed silence of her own, accepted upon the proper terms. Mrs. Furnivall arranged the matter that very afternoon. The arrangement settled into a steady winter routine. Clemency walked up to the dower cottage in the rectory garden each morning after breakfast at the park at 8:30, sat at her father's mahogany writing desk through the daylight hours from 9 until 5, took her plain tea at the dower cottage parlour fire at 4, and walked back up to the park by 5:30. She took her supper at the housekeeper's table at 6 with Mrs. Furnivall and Mrs. Bayswater. She retired to the small east wing bedchamber by 8, 3 afternoons of each week, the Wednesdays, the Fridays, and the Saturdays. Clemency went into the South Library at 11 o'clock for the reading. Cowper was finished in the 2nd week of January. They had begun Burney's Cecilia upon the Wednesday following in the small green and gilt 3-volume edition of 1782 from the South Library shelves. Severin read aloud in his quiet, deep baritone upon the Wednesdays and the Fridays and the Saturdays of one week. Clemency read aloud in her steady country voice upon the Wednesdays and the Fridays and the Saturdays of the next. The 2 of them alternated so by the week. Mrs. Furnivall sat in the wing chair at the south window with her sewing. The Calvert Deerhound Wensley lay upon the hearthrug between the 2 faded crimson leather wing chairs drawn close. A walking arrangement was added upon the 2nd Sunday in February, a half-hour walk in the South Park after the morning service, with Mrs. Furnivall 3 paces behind. Severin and Clemency walked the south gravel path from the south terrace to the small classical temple at the South Park boundary, and back again, in a quiet, steady pace, in plain country conversation upon the parish and the weather and the book they were then reading. 3 Sundays in February saw the walk, Mrs. Furnivall, in her plain bombazine and her warm winter cloak, 3 paces behind in steady chaperonage, the Deerhound Wensley walking at Severin's left hand. In the 1st week of February, upon a Wednesday afternoon at 3:30, in a small composed silence between the 3rd and 4th chapters of the 2nd volume of Cecilia, Clemency set her hand upon the closed book in her lap, looked across the hearth at Severin in the opposite wing chair, and said in her steady plain voice, "Your Grace, the dower cottage arrangement runs its 6 months at the end of March. I had not, in October, expected to be still at Wensley in April. I had not, in November, expected to be reading Burney in this room with you on a Wednesday afternoon in February. I shall be very content to return to Bayswater in April upon my £30 a year and my £36 a year from Hollygate. I should be glad to know your Grace's settled view on the matter." Severin Calvert, in the opposite wing chair, set his own hand upon the arm of the chair. He looked across at her in his steady gravity for a small, composed silence of his own of perhaps 20 seconds. The fire burned quietly. Mrs. Furnival, in the wing chair at the south window, did not raise her eyes from her sewing. The deerhound Wensley lay still upon the hearthrug. At the end of the 20 seconds, Severin said, in his quiet, deep baritone, "Miss Wainwright, I shall not press my settled view upon you in February. I shall press it upon you, with your kind leave, in the 3rd week of February, when the worst of the cold is past. Until then, may we read on?" Clemency inclined. She opened the book at the 4th chapter. She read on. Mrs. Furnival, upon the morning of Friday the 12th of February, in the kitchen at Wensleydale Park at 9:30, with Mrs. Bayswater at the great deal table rolling out the morning's pastry, set down the housekeeping book and remarked in her plain steady voice that the 4-acre settlement at Hollygate had been, in Mrs. Furnival's settled view, a poor reading of his Grace's intent from the start, that his Grace had not, in his settled mind, ever meant the 4 acres as a parish benevolent settlement of a tenant at peppercorn rent kind, but as a small marriage settlement of a wholly other kind, and that the matter should declare itself before the end of March. Mrs. Bayswater, in her plain blue print cotton with her apron, paused with the rolling pin in her hand. She said, "Mrs. Furnival, I had thought as much since the 2nd week of October." Mrs. Furnival inclined and took up the housekeeping book again. Mr. Quennell, asked his view by Mrs. Furnival upon the Saturday morning following, the 13th of February, in the butler's pantry over the morning's plate inspection, inclined and said only, "Mrs. Furnival, Her Grace the late Duchess would have approved Miss Wainwright in 3 days at the outside. I have, in the 4 months past, formed the same private opinion. I shall, however, decline to speak it further, as it is his Grace's office to make the matter public when he shall judge the hour." Mrs. Furnival inclined, and the plate inspection went on. Friday the 26th of February, 1819, at midnight. The house at Wensleydale Park was quiet. Mrs. Furnival had retired to her own room at 10 o'clock. Mrs. Bayswater had been abed by 9:30. Mr. Quennell had put out the great hall candles at 11 and had gone up the back stairs to his pantry bedchamber by 15:15. The household servants were all gone to bed by 11:30. Severin Calvert sat at the south library writing table in the dark of the long room, a single trimmed lamp at his right hand upon the table, a small steady fire of seasoned beech in the grate, the 2 faded crimson leather wing chairs drawn close to the hearth and both empty. The deerhound Wensley lay upon the hearthrug between them. The single trimmed lamp threw a small steady circle of light upon the green leather of the writing table. He took from the locked drawer at his left hand a small green calf commonplace book that had been his late father's, the 3rd Duke's, bequeathed to him at the 2nd Duke's death in March 1814. He turned past the close hand of the 3rd Duke, through the body of the volume to the first blank leaf at the back. He opened the standish. He took up his pen. He drafted in his quiet, steady hand the proposal he intended to deliver to Miss Wainwright the following morning at 11 o'clock, when she should come up to the South Library for the Saturday reading. He wrote it through twice. The first writing he read through once in his eye and set aside. The second writing he read through once in his eye, and then read aloud once, very low, to himself, in his deep, quiet baritone. 8 sentences, perhaps 190 words in all. He blotted the second writing. He closed the commonplace book upon the 8 sentences. He returned the volume to the locked drawer. He turned the small brass key in the lock. He put out the second candle at the right of the writing table. The single trimmed lamp burned alone. He rose from the writing table at 15:15 midnight. He took up the single trimmed lamp in his right hand. He walked to the south library door at the east end of the long room. He set his left hand upon the door handle. He stood a moment, looking back across the south library into the small steady circle of firelight at the hearth. the two faded crimson leather wing chairs drawn close, the deerhound Wensley asleep upon the hearthrug between them. The cold, pale blue Yorkshire February dawn was yet 8 hours off. He thought of his late mother, the third Duchess, who had liked Cowper and the Tatler and the early novels of Burney, and who had read to him at this very hearth on the December afternoons of his boyhood in the 1780s and early 1790s, in her quiet, steady voice from the same crimson leather wing chair at the right of the fire. He thought of his late wife, Lady Marjorie, who had not liked Cowper and had liked Burney no better, and who had read to him at this hearth only in the 3rd year of their marriage in the autumn of 1811, for perhaps a dozen evenings together, from a small volume of contemporary verse, the title of which he no longer perfectly remembered. He thought of Miss Clemency Wainwright, who had read at this hearth each Wednesday afternoon since the 7th of October, 1818, and each Friday and each Saturday since the 3rd week of October, 20 Wednesdays in succession, and the same Fridays and Saturdays besides, in her plain black bombazine which had only in the last week of February now begun to be relieved by a thin band of grey and black trim at the cuff, the trim being Mrs. Furnival's own quiet handiwork of the previous Sunday afternoon. He thought of the 8 sentences locked in the small green cuff commonplace book in the drawer at the writing table. He thought of the hour of 11 o'clock upon the Saturday morning, yet 8 hours hence. He turned from the south library door. He pulled the south library door quietly to behind him. He went up the great staircase, by the single-trimmed lamp in his right hand. He went to bed. Saturday the 27th of February, 1819, came in cold and pale blue over the North Riding, a thin Yorkshire sun upon the frost of the south lawn and the long shadows of the great oaks lying still and quiet upon the grass. By 11 o'clock, the South Library at Wensleydale Park had its small steady fire of seasoned beech burning low, and even beneath the marble chimney-piece and the long polished walnut writing table was set as it had been set on every reading afternoon of the past 5 months, the volume of Cowper at the centre, the cut-glass inkstand pushed aside, the 2 faded crimson leather wing-chairs drawn a little inward toward the hearth. Mrs. Furnival was at her usual place by the south door, her sewing in her lap, her grey head bent at composed quiet over the plain seam she had brought up with her that morning. Clemency had come down the long passage at 5 minutes before the hour, her plain black bombazine still, for she had not yet put off her mourning at 6 months, and had taken her usual right-hand chair. She had opened the Cowper to the place she had marked the Tuesday afternoon previous. She had not, when Severin came in 2 minutes after the hour, looked up at once. She had finished the line. Then she had risen, set the volume down upon the writing table, and waited. He had crossed the worn Turkey rug without sitting. He had stood a moment at the hearth, one hand upon the marble, and had looked once at Mrs. Furnival, who had bent the lower over her sewing without lifting her head. He had then turned and faced Clemency across the small distance of the rug. "Miss Wainwright," he said, and his voice was steady and low. "I had not, when I drove down to the curate's cottage on the 3rd of October to install the new curate, expected to find you at the door with your 3 boxes and your father's writing desk waiting for a late carrier. I had not, in the 8 months since, expected the quiet that has come into the South Library at your reading. I had not expected to look forward to 3 afternoons a week of Cowper read aloud at my mother's old fire as I have looked forward to no other hour these 5 years. I am asking now, plainly, that you should consider the proposal of becoming my wife. The decision is wholly yours. You may have whatever time you need. If your answer is no, the dower cottage and the 4 acres are yours regardless, and the library shall be open to you on whatever terms shall please you." He did not move from the hearth. He did not, in any small gesture of pressing, take one step forward upon the rug. He waited. Clemency stood at composed quiet, with her hands at her sides. She did not look down. She did not look at Mrs. Furnival, whose needle had stopped without sound. She looked at Severin, and did not speak. The case clock on the south wall, the long cased clock of plain English oak that had stood there since the second Duke's time, went on with its slow, steady beat, the brass pendulum swinging at its old measure behind the small glazed door. After what may have been a half-minute, or may have been a longer thing, it struck the quarter past with two soft brass notes, one and then the second, and the small chime of them faded into the warm, small silence of the room. Clemency drew one steady breath. "Your Grace," she said, "I shall." Severin inclined deeply at the hearth. He did not speak. He crossed the rug then, in 3 measured steps, and stopped 1 pace from her. He took her ungloved right hand, for she had laid her gloves upon the writing-table beside the cowpair, and lifted it once, briefly, to his mouth. He kissed the back of it at the knuckle, with the small, composed gravity of a man who has waited 5 months, and let it go. Mrs. Furnival's needle had begun again. She did not look up. The case clock went on. The cowper lay open upon the writing-table at the place that had been marked. The mourning continued. Severin rang once at the small bell beside the chimney-piece. Quennell came at the south door, white-haired and plain in his black butler's coat, and was told that the carriage would be wanted at 2 for Crawley Hall. Lady Constance was to be informed. Quennell inclined and withdrew, and the small door closed without sound behind him. Severin returned to the hearth. Clemency returned to her chair. Mrs. Furnival's sewing went on at the south door, and the cowper was read for the half-hour, as it was read every Saturday morning, in the steady, low voice of the new betrothed, with the cold, pale blue Yorkshire February light lying upon the worn turkey rug between them. At 3 that afternoon, the travelling coach was at the south door, and Severin handed Clemency in himself, and they drove the 11 miles across the cold, pale blue north, riding to Crawley Hall in the East Ridings border country. Lady Constance received them in the small green parlour. She was alone. Sir Hereward had been out at the home farm since the morning, and she rose at once from her plain country chair as they were shown in. Severin took her hand. He said only, "Constance, Miss Wainwright has done me the honour." Lady Constance looked once at her brother. She looked once at Clemency, who stood at composed quiet in the plain black bombazine. Then she crossed the small room in 3 steps and put her arms about Clemency, and she wept once. One short, steady weeping with her cheek against Clemency's shoulder. And she laughed through it, a small bright laugh that was half breath and half steadiness, and she stepped back and put her hands upon Clemency's 2 arms and looked at her with the kind hazel eyes. "My dear," she said, "my dear, I have been hoping for this since the first afternoon of October." Sir Hereward came in from the home farm at 4:30, with the country mud still at his boots. He was told in the small green parlour what had been settled. He crossed to Severin without a word, and shook his hand once, the long, steady country handshake of a brother-in-law of 15 years' standing, and then he turned to Clemency and inclined gravely, and said, "Miss Wainwright, you are very welcome." He did not say more. He did not need to. The banns were called at St. Andrew's, Wensley by the How, on the 3 following Sundays, by the Reverend Carlyon at his usual place at the chancel step. They were called on the morning of Sunday the 28th of February, the day after the proposal, and on the morning of Sunday the 7th of March, and on the morning of Sunday the 14th of March, in the white-haired country rector's steady country voice, with the small composed gravity of the old form, and the parish heard them out in silence and inclined their heads at the proper places. On the second Sunday, the parish women, the farmers' wives and the cottagers' wives, and the 2 old Mrs. Hollins, who had laid out Clemency's mother in 1812 and her father in 1818, brought up posies of early snowdrops from their winter gardens and laid them at the chancel rail in small white and green clusters, without speech, and went back to their pews. Clemency, sitting beside Lady Constance in the Wensleydale pew, inclined her head once to them as she went out by the south porch. Saturday the 20th of March, 1819, dawned at the same cold pale blue as the morning of the proposal 3 weeks before. By 10 o'clock, the small 12th century Yorkshire parish church of pale Yorkshire stone, low square Norman tower, plain oak pews, narrow lancet windows, admitting cold pale blue Yorkshire late winter light, was filled at the back with the parish and at the front with the Wensleydale household, and at every pew end there had been pinned by the two old Mrs. Hollins at 6 that morning a posy of snowdrops and dark green ivy. Severin stood at the chancel step in the black superfine wedding tailcoat that had been brought up from London the Thursday previous, with a single sprig of snowdrop pinned at the lapel and the black crepe mourning band off the left arm 1 week previous, his hands at composed quiet at his sides, and his face very still. Sir Hereward stood beside him in plain dark green coat. The Reverend Carlyon was at his place, at the altar rail in his plain black cassock, his prayer book open at the form for the solemnization of matrimony, the cold, pale blue North Riding light lying across the worn pages. The small south door opened at 10 of the clock, precisely. The parish turned in its pews. Mr. Treadgold came up the short aisle in plain black, superfine gold-rimmed spectacles upon his thin grey face, Clemency upon his right arm. She wore simple, high-waisted ivory silk with short puff sleeves and a single narrow row of small antique seed pearls at the hem, long plain ivory silk gloves, a small coronet of snowdrops pinned to the smooth low chignon of her dark russet hair, the heirloom Calvert blonde lace, 1782 wedding veil pinned to the coronet. She came up the aisle at composed, steady pace. She did not look about her. She looked at the chancel step. Lady Constance, in plain pale cream silk, stood at the matron of honour's place to the left of the altar rail. Mr. Quennell and Mrs. Furnival and Mrs. Bayswater sat in the front pews of the household side. Mrs. Bayswater in plain blue print cotton with apron set aside for the day, in plain Sunday black, Mrs. Furnival in her best dark bombazine, Mr. Quennell at his 32nd year butler's gravity in plain black, behind them the rest of the household, and in the back pews the whole parish, the farmers and the cottagers, and the two old Mrs. Hollins, and the new curate, Mr. Thorne, in his plain black wool, sitting at the very back with the small composed quiet of a young man who knew his place. Mr. Treadgold brought Clemency to the chancel step and gave her into Severin's hand and stepped back to the front pew of the household side. The Reverend Carlyon began the form. The vows were exchanged in the old plain English. Severin's voice was low and very steady. Clemency's voice did not falter. Severin set upon the third finger of her left hand the plain gold band that had been made up at the Northallerton jewellers the fortnight previous, and the Reverend Carlyon pronounced them man and wife together, and joined their two hands beneath his own, and gave the blessing in the country voice. The parish inclined its head. The cold, pale blue Yorkshire late winter light lay along the lancet windows. Outside the low square, Norman tower a single rook called once and was silent. The wedding breakfast was at the long mahogany dining table at Wensleydale Park. The whole household sat down at it, for Severin had directed that the household should sit at the lower end of the long table on this morning, with the family and the parish gentry at the upper end, and Quennell himself, after the long ceremony of conducting them in and pouring the first glass for each, took his own chair at the very foot. And Mrs. Bayswater's wedding cake stood at the centre of the long table, a plain English fruit cake of her own making under pale Yorkshire icing, with a small spray of fresh snowdrops laid at its top. Lady Constance's elder sister-in-law, Mrs. Crawley of the East Riding, said the grace at the head of the long table in her clear country voice. The old short blessing the Crawleys had said for 3 generations, and the household inclined its heads in unison. Sir Hereward stood after the first course and gave the country toast at his place at Severin's right hand, plain and brief and steady. He wished the bride and groom long quiet years at Wensleydale, and the patience to keep them, and the health to enjoy them. He sat down without flourish, and the long table drank to it once, and set down its glasses. Mr. Treadgold rose at his own place near the foot. He gave the brief lawyer's blessing in the gold-rimmed spectacles. A 4-sentence thing, very dry and very kind. That the marriage settlement, drawn up the previous fortnight in his Northallerton office, made full and proper provision for the new Duchess and for any children of the marriage, and that he had the honour of standing, this morning, not as the solicitor of the late Reverend Wainwright of the curate's cottage, nor as the solicitor of the Wensleydale estate, but as the man who had brought the bride up the aisle of St. Andrew's an hour before. He inclined to clemency. She inclined to him. He sat. Mr. Quennell at the foot of the table did not toast. He sat at composed quiet, the white-haired old butler in his 32nd year, and saw that each glass at the long table was kept full and each plate was kept fresh, and at the end of the ceremony of it, he rose and conducted the household out at the proper pace, and the wedding breakfast was done. In the afternoon, after the carriages of the parish gentry had gone away down the long oak avenue, Severin and Clemency walked the long gallery together. The cold, pale blue Yorkshire March afternoon came in through the leaded windows along the north wall in long pale shafts upon the polished oak floor, and the portraits of the 4 generations of the Calverts hung at their old places along the south wall, the first Duke in his Sir Joshua of 1750, the second Duke in his Hopner of 1810, the third Duke and Lady Marjorie hand in hand in their double portrait of 1812, and at the far end, the small, empty place upon the panelling where, Severin said quietly as they passed, the 4th Duke and his Duchess would be hung the spring following, when Hopner had been able to come up from London for the sittings. They walked slowly. They did not speak much. They came to the end of the gallery at the south window, and stood a moment looking out over the cold, pale blue South Park, with its long March shadows upon the frost, and turned and walked the gallery back the way they had come. 1 year and 11 days after the wedding, on the cold, pale blue Saturday morning of the 4th of March, 1820, their first child, a son, christened Hollis Severin Calvert, Marquis of Howe, was baptised at the parish church of St. Andrew's at Wensley by the How in the North Riding of Yorkshire, by the Reverend Carlyon, with Lady Constance Crawley standing as godmother and Sir Hereward Crawley as godfather. The infant was 4 weeks and 1 day old. The heirloom Calvert christening robe of ivory silk and old Mechlin lace, last used at Severin's christening in the spring of 1784, came out of the cedarwood chest in the south wing nursery. The family Bible entry was written that evening in the 4th Duke of Wensleydale's own hand at the South Library writing table, beneath the entry for his late wife, Lady Marjorie Calvert of October 1813, and beside the entry for his wife's late father, the Reverend Hollis Wainwright of September 1818, the 2 old losses and the 1 new beginning sitting upon the page, together for the first time. The pen was set down, the blotter was laid across the wet ink, The great family Bible was closed at composed quiet upon the South Library writing table, and the small steady fire of seasoned beech went on burning in the marble chimney-piece. And upstairs in the south wing nursery, the infant Marquis slept under the watch of the new nurse and Mrs. Furnival, and the long quiet of the house came down over the cold, pale blue Saturday evening. Tuesday, the 27th of October, 1820, came on quiet and clear over the North Riding, a thin autumn frost upon the south lawn at sunset, and the long blue shadows of the great oaks lying still upon the grass. By 8:30 in the evening, the South Library at Wensleydale Park had its single trimmed lamp lit upon the long polished walnut writing table, and the small steady fire of seasoned beech burning low and even beneath the marble chimney-piece, and the two faded crimson leather wing chairs drawn close together at the hearth upon the worn Turkey rug. Clemency sat in her usual right-hand wing chair. She had laid aside the plain dark blue afternoon dress for the evening dress of plain dark green silk that had been made up at Northallerton in the spring, and she had a volume of Miss Austen's new novel, Persuasion, in the small posthumous octavo that had come down from the London bookseller the month previous, open in her lap. She was reading aloud in the steady, low voice that had not altered since the first afternoon of October 1818, and the chapter she had reached was that of Captain Wentworth's letter, and she read it through without hurrying. Severin sat in the wing-chair opposite, in steady, composed quiet. He did not interrupt. He did not move from his place. He listened. The light from the single-trimmed lamp lay along the side of his face. The small streak of silver at the right temple, which had been only the one streak in 1818, was a thicker streak now in 1820, and the line at the corner of his mouth was at composed quiet rather than at the old composed quiet of a man at the end of a long widowed grief. Upstairs in the south wing nursery, beyond the long quiet of two passages and a half-flight of stairs, the infant Marquis of Howe, 7 months old that fortnight, lay asleep in the heirloom Calvert cradle of carved oak that had been Severin's own in 1784 and his father's in 1752. He did not stir. The house was very quiet. Clemency came to the end of the chapter. She did not turn the page. She closed the small octavo upon her finger to keep the place, and lifted her hazel eyes to Severin in the chair opposite, and inclined her head a little. And Severin inclined his head a little in return. The small, composed gesture of a husband at the close of an evening's reading, and the fire went on burning at its low, steady measure in the chimney-piece, and the small case clock on the south wall struck the 3/4 once with its soft brass note, and the long quiet of the South Library settled over the two of them at the hearth. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise, and stories that begin with a Tacitus on a stone bench, and stories that begin with a tortoise-shell cat asleep upon an embroidered cushion, and stories that begin with a brush dragging on a cold flagstone, and stories that begin with a letter from Quatre Bras read aloud in a Bath upper room, and stories that begin with a young widow standing at the foot of her late husband's stair, and stories that begin with a young woman stepping down from a mail coach with a single carpet bag, and stories that begin with a public notice in the Morning Chronicle, and stories that begin with 3 short entries in a governess's leather pocket diary. And there are, quietest of all, of the smallest catalogue of inanimate possessions, and the largest patient steadiness in the bearing, stories that begin with a probate inventory, drawn up by a Northallerton solicitor on the cold, pale blue afternoon of Friday the 18th of September, 1818, of the effects of a country curate dead that morning of a quick fever, 3 boxes of books, 1 writing desk of mahogany, 1 annuity of £30 a year, and the inventory's 7th item, that the curate's daughter, 26, was to vacate the curate's cottage by the last day of October. And so, on the cold, pale blue Saturday morning of the 20th of March, in the year of our Lord, 1819, in the small Yorkshire parish church of St Andrew at Wensley by the How, under the cold blue North Riding late winter sun, Miss Clemency Wainwright, who had stood at the door of her late father's cottage on the cold blue morning of the 3rd of October the year before, with her 3 boxes and her mahogany writing desk, and her father's small black valise waiting for a late carrier, in plain black bombazine and a £30 annuity, and the 7th item of a Northallerton solicitor's inventory, became, by the patient's steady asking of the Duke, who had remembered her face from a Howe County Assembly of August 1816, and had spent the 5 months following her father's death not pressing his case, the 4th Duchess of Wensleydale, and the wife the woman his late mother had given him, in dying, the long, quiet patience to wait for.